At number 10 we have a pit full of arms. I don't think anything nice was ever found at the bottom of a pit. No one has gone to the base of a pit and found a PlayStation 5 with The Last of Us 3. It's almost always death, and this pit was no different. Some archaeologists in France came across a super deep pit. Like if you fell in it you would die 100% of the time. There's no way you're sticking that landing, not at all. So it makes sense at the bottom of this pit they found a bunch of skeletons from people who had been thrown into the pit. It was Death Pit, which is the name of the metal band I'm going to start after this video. Now the thing that was so shocking about the bodies that were thrown into this pit of despair is what happened to the bodies before they were thrown into the pit. All the people had their arms chopped off and their skulls bashed in. Like, you're already going to throw the people to their death. Why would you mutilate their bodies before you chuck them in? The pit was literally layered. At the bottom layer was all arms and the top layer was all bodies that had their heads smashed in. Like some sort of sick cake. Who would do such a thing? Well, the bodies were dated back to 4000 BC, so their motivations were very unknown, but it's probably just because they were cavemen. At number 9 we have the black sarcophagus. This is my problem with archaeologists. They're always digging around finding things that maybe don't want to be found. Maybe something was buried 20 feet underground because it was never supposed to be opened ever again. Like the black sarcophagus. This thing was dug up in 2018 and right away people were saying that this thing was cursed. It got posted all over the internet and it spread around like a mid-tier meme. Like, you know, the kind of meme that lasts for like 2 or 3 weeks at best. Like when you look at it you just blow air out of your nose and then move on. Like that kind of meme. It wasn't great. Well, everyone said that this thing was going to rain fire from the sky if it was ever opened. I mean, and it does look like something pulled right out of a movie. And guess what the archaeologists did anyways? They opened it. Oh, this creepy box that might kill everyone? Let's just open it just in case. There might be a boat in there, who knows? Now nothing can be connected directly to the sarcophagus, but remember how much people were complaining about 2019 and saying a bunch of bad stuff happened? Coincidence? I think not. At number 8 we have head on your chest. How do you want to die? This might be something you want to pick because it's the only thing in life that you can guarantee. I want to die on TV saying something cool, so my death quote gets turned into a meme like 100 times. It's like all over the internet. I want my death to be turned into like an Infinity War level meme, like a huge level meme. Also, side note, Thanos did nothing wrong. But I don't think that these guys got to pick their death. There were some weird bodies that were discovered in England. They were dated back to the 14th century. The weird thing about these bodies is that they were all buried laying flat with their heads propped up on their chest like they were holding a basketball, which means that someone was chopping off these dudes' heads before they sent them into the ground. Not the most fun way to die, but at least they got to keep their head. They didn't start kicking it around like a soccer ball or something. If I was one of the guys in charge, I would bury them, but I would switch their heads around so the person finding them would have to do a match game to match up the right heads. At number 7 we have puzzle time. Did you know that if you throw a person's body into a bog and it's cold enough, it will help preserve the body? Well, I didn't know this either until I started making this list. Well, there was a dude in Scotland who found some bodies that had been buried for hundreds of years, but it seemed like before they were buried, someone had been doing some bog therapy on them to keep them in a preserved state. This is slightly creepy, but let's kick it up a notch. There were 2 bodies found, a man and a woman. Both of their bodies were very strange. There were limbs and body parts that seemed to be too large for their frame, almost like it was some sort of mutation. Everyone was confused. Well, thanks to the magic of DNA, the people digging up these bodies were able to find out that this happened because someone had been taking different body parts from several dead bodies and assembling them to make some sort of creation. Very creepy. And some of the mismatched body parts were hundreds of years older than the others. How did someone find bodies that were hundreds of years old, and why did they try to attach them to other people's bodies? That's something we will never know. At number 6 we have the cheese. Usually people digging around in Egypt want to find a gold tomb that is filled with guys wrapped in toilet paper. But every now and again you find something a little more strange. A tomb in Egypt had a little snack inside waiting to be dug up. Why would this be on a list of scary things? Well, because the cheese was over 3,000 years old and was packed with some unknown bacteria. If someone was dumb enough to bite into this cheese, they could unleash a plague that could wipe out humanity as we know it. Death would sweep through the world and ravage every last man, woman, and child. There would be nowhere on earth that you would be able to be safe from the terrors of this bloody cheese. People would become cheese monsters, like all the creatures that walk around in The Last of Us, except they would smell like Parmesan. Well, either that or the dude would just get the worst diarrhea of his life, like poop water for like 8 weeks straight or something. Really, either is possible when you weigh it out. At number 5 we have Wolverine-ish. For this next one, it really depends on what part of the story you look at to whether or not this will be a nightmare to you. So in Italy, a body was found from someone who seemed to be from the 8th century. He was a pretty old dude, and this guy had his arm chopped off right above the elbow. Now that is the scary part, someone amputating part of your body. No one wants to have their arm chopped off at any joint. But in place of his missing forearm was a big knife. This guy had a stump, and then at the end of it was an engineered prosthetic that had a knife on it. He had a knife hand, which I think is cool as hell. This guy could be walking around in the year 800 punch stabbing people like a G. Punch stab, punch stab, punch stab, punch stab, punch stab. This guy's cool as hell. But I can understand why that would scare people, because you never want to be on the bad end of a guy punch stabbing you. At number 4, we have a gnawing sensation. The body of a Roman woman had a little surprise in her nether regions, and let me tell you, it was not a sexy one. Not everything below the belt gets hot. In fact, this was one of the most gross things that has ever been discovered, and I never want to come in contact with anything like this ever again. Well, this lady was found with a tumor in her pelvis. What was crazy about it is that the tumor was caused by an infected egg inside of her womb. This would cause the egg to partially develop, and the tumor had teeth in it. Ugh. That sounds like something that should be pulled out of a horror movie. The living tumor that has come to take over your planet. You will all be slaves to this toothy monster. Because this lady happened to die before x-rays were even a concept, there's a good chance you had no idea what dental danger was inside her body. At number 3, we have vampires. As much as we complain about the world, it's nice to know that things used to be way worse. Like maybe you don't like your job, or maybe you were stuck in traffic, or maybe you even got dumped. But at least you weren't tortured to death because people thought you were a vampire. A tomb in Bulgaria uncovered a man from the 1200s who seemed to be horribly murdered, most likely by people who thought he was some sort of vampiric monster. It seemed that he was forced into a grave, and then someone took a bladed weapon to his leg and hacked it off. And because the only way to kill a vampire is to stab it through its heart, they hammered a steel stake through this dude's chest, pinning him to his own grave. Joke's on them, you have to use a wooden stake, so this guy rose from the dead to seek revenge. Just kidding, he died for sure. He was for sure dead. At number 2, we have Pit of Sorrow. Something this list has taught me is that things have definitely got nicer over time. I know the world isn't perfect, but this next point shows how commonplace brutality used to be. There was a pit found in Austria that had an entire tribe of people in it. 94 bodies were found, and they were all dated back to 5200 BC. Now, how did all these people from the tribe die in the same place? Well, they were attacked, and from the looks of it, it seemed like the opposing tribe came in to wipe them all out. Everyone in the pit had their head cracked open, and then had their knees and legs snapped, and some of them had arrowheads lodged in their backs. The thing that sent this over the edge is that 27 of the 94 bodies were children. This tribe, the attacking tribe, made sure that everyone was dead except for women. There were only 2 female bodies found in the gravesite, so this most likely means that the women were all taken into slavery. Alright, for the number 1 spot, we have some hidden tunnels that were dug up in Chavinduantar in Peru. The tunnels zigzagged into all sorts of hidden rooms that could have been used as some sort of hiding place or escape route from invading tribes, but it seemed that the main thing that the tunnels were used for was sacrificing people in rituals. Several bodies were discovered that were dismembered in all sorts of strange ways. They would be strapped down to altars and then mutilated to death. Some of them had their heads chopped off, and others seemed to have their hearts pulled out of their chest while they were still alive. Imagine someone putting a bag over your head in the middle of the night and then dragging you to some horrible underground layer and then cutting your still beating heart out of your chest. That's one hell of a Friday night.
Starting off this countdown, we have Cleopatra's tomb. I'm sure you all have learned about Cleopatra and her relationship with both Julius Caesar and, of course, Mark Antony. She was an Egyptian icon known for her intelligence and beauty. But here's the thing. Her tomb still remains lost. It's still undiscovered somewhere near Alexandria, Egypt. In 31 BC, Cleopatra and her lover took their own lives after Octavian defeated them. They rather die than be under his domination. The two were then buried together near a temple of the Egyptian goddess Isis. But the exact location of this tomb is still a huge mystery, and obviously archaeologists are desperate to find it, but they are fearing the worst. They believe there's a high chance that the grave is already empty due to grave robbers. Moving on to number 9, we have King Tut's tomb. So let's stay in Egypt for a little bit longer as we dive into this next point. In 1922, King Tut's tomb was unearthed by Egyptologist Howard Carter and his crew. And that's when stories about the tomb being cursed took off. It said that whoever disturbs the rest of the king will be cursed. Several weeks after opening his tomb, Carter's team started to die mysteriously. And people were like, oh my god, this curse is real. Believe whatever. But it was discovered that his tomb was covered in 2 dangerous types of mold. These molds can cause reactions ranging from congestion to bleeding in the lungs. Hence why archaeologists need to be extremely careful when exploring the area. Not only that, but they believe that there's more to this tomb than they have discovered. There's evidence that King Tut was buried in a hurry. They believe maybe this tomb was originally built for someone else, and that there may be other undiscovered mummies buried in this same tomb. In our 8th spot, we have the Copper Scroll treasure. In 1952, archaeologists discovered a number of Dead Sea Scrolls in a cave in the west bank of Qumran National Park. One of the scrolls piqued everyone's interest, and that's because it wasn't like any of the other ones. This scroll was copper with writing engraved onto it. What's even more fascinating is that the scroll apparently talks about hidden treasure. Obviously, archaeologists don't want you knowing this with fear that someone will be able to decode it and find the treasure before them. They believe that there is a high chance that the treasure is real. Now, the scroll dates back to over 1900 years ago, during a time when the Roman Empire controlled the Qumran settlement. Researchers believe that the locals hid the treasure to keep it out of the hands of the Roman forces, and then they created this scroll so that the treasure would be unearthed in the future. In our 7th spot, we have Abu Minna. Located in Egypt, Abu Minna is a town filled with ruins of a church, monasteries, houses, workshops, etc. It was built in remembrance of Saint Minas of Alexandria, who died in 296 AD. The town was actually buried on top of this tomb. As a result, it's thought to be a very holy area. However, this site is now greatly endangered and is now a UNESCO World Heritage Archaeological Site. This site is endangered due to the rise in water level. It is facing constant deterioration. By 2001, it was getting so destroyed that conservation measures were put in place to protect it. In our 6th spot, we have Samarra City. Between 1911 to 1914, an ancient civilization was found in Samarra, Iraq. This civilization thrived between 5500 BC and 3900 BC. Archaeologists found a huge ancient mosque and a spiral minaret. However, over the years, it has been destroyed. Between 2006 to 2007, there was a bombardment at the mosque, and 2 of the minarets and a clock tower got destroyed. As a result, this site was shut down. It is now on the list of World Heritage Sites endangered by UNESCO. We are now at our 5th and halfway mark with the Deadly Tomb. Now imagine coming across a huge archaeological site on your own property. Well, that's what happened in 1974 to a group of Chinese farmers. They were digging on their land when they hit something hard. They continued digging and unearthed a life-sized terracotta soldier. After that, archaeologists spent 4 decades excavating the site. In total, they found 8,000 of these life-size soldiers. All these soldiers were created to guard the tomb of Emperor Jin Shi Huang. Back then, it was believed that these statues could protect the emperor in the afterlife. Typically, real-life individuals were sacrificed and buried alongside people of power. That was until this emperor, when they thought, we can't kill thousands of people, so let's just make statues instead. It's a very fascinating site, but sadly it's off limits to everyone, even archaeologists. And that's because there's a high concentration of mercury in the tomb. Also, they believe that the emperor is protected by deadly booby traps. So instead of risking their lives trying to investigate, they just leave this site alone. Moving on to number 4, we have the Paris Catacombs. The Paris Catacombs are a series of tunnels located underneath Paris, France. In the 18th century, the catacombs were created when the Paris cemeteries were full and they needed a place to bury the dead. As a result, they buried the dead underground in a series of tunnels. It's believed that there is around 6 million bodies buried in these catacombs. Now, here's the thing. There are portions of the tunnels open to the public for tours and such. However, over the years, a number of people have strayed off the path and have actually gotten lost. Like, there are 150 miles of tunnels in a maze-like fashion, so it's very easy to get lost. And a number of people have actually died after wandering off. So maybe stick to the path or don't go on the tour. There's enough dead bodies down there, they don't need any more. In our third spot today, we have Sabritha, Libya. This is another beautiful site that is at risk. The archaeological site of Sabritha was excavated in 1921 and consists of an amphitheater with a 3-story backdrop wall. Then you got temples and a church with beautiful, colorful mosaic flooring. However, these Roman monuments were made of soft sandstone, so weather and soil erosion are quickly destroying these structures. It's also on the list of World Heritage Sites in danger. In our second spot, we have the City of Gold. This is a mythological place said to be filled with great fortune. Although this is said to be just a legend, rumor has it that it could be indeed real. In fact, some say it's located near the Colombian city of Bogota. Others believe that it is in Bombay, India. In fact, for over 300 years, people have gone to Bombay in search of this gold. However, many have died as a result. If this city of gold is real, archaeologists certainly don't want the public knowing, and it would cause more deaths and fighting and war. And in our number one spot today, we have Murder Island. In 2017, a mass grave was unearthed on an island off the western coast of Australia. This island has since been given the name Murder Island. The grave contains the remains of 5 individuals who survived shipwreck. In 1629, their ship called the Batava sank nearby. They managed to make their way to this island where they died of dehydration, or so it's thought. Shortly after, more than 100 other survivors were brutally murdered by mutineers and were also buried on this island. This is said to be Australia's darkest mass killing. Starting off this countdown, we have the dog bones. In 2012, archaeologist Karina Gutierrez was excavating a site between the zebra and hippo pens of a zoo in Peru when she came across something very gruesome and shocking. She unearthed more than 100 dogs resting alongside hundreds of humans. This site is said to be more than 900 years old. The human remains showed signs of torture and violence, suggesting that they died a gruesome death. The dogs, on the other hand, were ritually strangled. It's thought that they were buried alongside their owners as part of a ceremony. This is a very, very dark thing to come across. Coming in at number 9, we have the impaled heads. In 2009, a new railway bridge was being created in Sweden's Motala Strom River. That's when archaeologists started to unearth artifacts that were thousands of years old. Over the next few years, more and more artifacts were found in that area. You got animal bones, to tools made from animal bones, to remnants of human skulls, and lastly, mounted skulls. This is said to be the most grisly thing that archaeologists in that area have found. So the skulls were 8,000 years old and were impaled on wooden stakes. All skulls were missing their jaw bones and had shown signs of trauma. The male skulls had blunt force trauma to the top of the head, while the female skulls had trauma to the sides and back of their head. But that's not the way that they died. Studies had shown that the wounds had healed, so they did not die immediately after sustaining those injuries. Then at some point, the victims' heads were chopped off and placed on stakes and then submerged underwater in the middle of the lake. They were placed on a stone platform surrounded by animal bones. Again, this is a very traumatizing thing to come across. In our 8th spot, we have the witch prison. In 2016, historians were restoring St. Mary's Chapel at the Kirk of St. Nicholas when they found a weird ring mounted into the wall. Dr. Arthur Winfield, who was leading this project to restore and preserve the chapel, was pretty skeptical about this ring. At first, he thought it was nothing. But then he decided to do some digging. He checked out the city's archives, and that's when he discovered the chapel's dark past. Back in 1597, the church played a crucial role in the Great Witch Hunt. The witches were taken to the chapel and chained up to this ring. This was their last stop before being executed and burned to death. So all of a sudden, this ring became much, much darker. After excavating the area, the bodies of 22 young individuals were unearthed. No remains of the accused witches were found at this site, so it's believed that they were buried elsewhere. This iron ring embedded into the north wall of the chapel is now all that remains of this gruesome past. In our 7th spot, we have Lascaux Caves. Legend goes that back in the day, 4 teens were exploring this cave system in France with their dog when they found a narrow entrance to a cavern. Being brave, they entered, and that's when they found an archaeologist's dream. The cavern was filled with prehistoric cave paintings. These paintings are 15 to 17,000 years old and depict a series of images including tons of animals. In total, there are 600 wall paintings covering the interior walls and ceilings of this cave. In 1948, this site was open to the public. People were welcome to come into the cave and see the beautiful paintings. But in 1963, it had to be closed. The artificial light was fading the vivid colors of these paintings. It also caused algae to start growing over them. So in order to preserve the history, no one is allowed to visit there. In fact, only a small number of scientists are allowed in, but they only have a few days a month to be in there. Other than that, they are kept locked away. Moving on to number 6, we have the East Kirk of St. Nicholas. So over the years, more work has been done on the Kirk of St. Nicholas. In 2006 and 2007, it was the site of a major archaeological excavation. Basically, they were excavating the site before the restoration work could be done. Well, upon doing so, they came across the remains of more than 2,000 people. 1,000 were the remains of entire skeletons, so they weren't missing any parts. It's believed that most of the bodies were buried before the 1560s, because after that, the Protestant Reformation in Scotland banned the burials of people inside churches. They also found the graves of 9 young individuals whose body had been laid out together, forming an arc shape. We are now at our 5th and halfway mark with El Dorado. The lost city of El Dorado is a famous myth that dates back to the 16th century. El Dorado is the name of a secret city of gold said to be located deep within South America. It's said to be filled with riches beyond your wildest dreams. When the Spanish conquistadors heard of this tale, they tried with all their power to find the city of gold. Alas, they were unsuccessful. But legend goes that archaeologists have discovered this city, and if they have, of course, they don't want this known to the public, at least not yet. Could you imagine what would happen if word got out that there is a city filled with priceless artifacts and gold? People would go nuts and totally ransack the place and ruin its beauty. So that's why it's believed that this place is being kept a secret. That is until they have removed all the treasures and have done all the research that they need to. Coming in at number 4, we have the ancient city of Aleppo. This is known as Syria's second city, and is said to be among the world's oldest continuously inhabited cities. It's filled with ancient structures and has one of the oldest and biggest castles around the world. But here's the thing, this site is now an endangered World Heritage Site. The overpopulation and commercialization is taking a toll on this beautiful ancient city. The new developments and overcrowding have threatened the ancient cityscape, which is like every archaeologist's worst nightmare. Moving on to number 3, we have their labs. After a big dig, archaeologists bring their findings back to the lab. What happens there is pretty private. Every single artifact that they find is washed, dried, identified, labeled, and then cataloged. All of this is done with precision and care. Imagine how much crap they would get in if they dropped or broke an artifact. Obviously, for many reasons, archaeologists like to keep their lab a secret, and I don't blame them. Imagine your personal workspace being available for everyone in the world to see. Coming in at number 2, we have Dead Man's Island. The Dead Man's Island in the UK is now a forbidden island. No one is allowed to travel there unless you receive special permission, but no one wants to go there anyways. Not only is it rumored to be haunted, but it's filled with dead bodies. Basically, the island was the dumping ground for men and boys who died while on board prison ships. They didn't want to bring them back to the mainland, so they buried them on this island to prevent infectious diseases from spreading. But over the years, coastal erosion and the tides unearthed these bodies. In 2016, the remains of more than 200 men were found on the island. They were then reburied. But the changing tides continued to unearth the bodies and wash them out to sea. So they kind of just gave up and left the island and all of its bodies alone. And in our number 1 spot today, we have the lost city of Atlantis. I'm sure you all grew up hearing tales about the magical lost city of Atlantis that lay submerged somewhere in the Atlantic Ocean. Well, it turns out this city might be real. First, let's look at the history of this city. Atlantis was first described by Plato over 2,000 years ago. He said that the island had over 10,000 chariots and hundreds of bulls and elephants. Then over the years, the city fell and eventually got submerged into the Atlantic Ocean. For centuries, historians debated whether this city was real or not. Then, in 1882, a man named Ignatius Donnelly published a book titled Atlantis, the Antediluvian World. In this book, he claimed that Atlantis was a real place. He even claimed that all the known ancient civilizations originated from Atlantis' Neolithic culture. If this is real, then surely archaeologists and historians are madly searching for the city. In fact, they might have found it already, and similar to El Dorado, they are keeping it a secret. Starting off this countdown, we have the booby traps. When pharaohs passed away, they were buried with all their belongings and a bunch of valuables. Because of this, they didn't want anyone raiding the tomb and disrupting the pharaoh's body. So basically, they designed booby traps / security systems. This includes rooms that led to nowhere and fake walls that robbers would break thinking that there would be valuables behind it, only to find nothing. The scary part though, they also had false floors that would break upon stepping on them, and then the person would fall down into a death pit. Basically, a hole with spikes and spears. Ouch. So researchers need to be very careful when exploring these ancient ruins. One wrong step and that could be it for them. Moving on, at number 9, we have the missing body. In 1934, Djoser, the first king of the 3rd dynasty of Egypt, was found. I mean, kind of. Only his mummified left foot was found. It was detached from the rest of his body. Dude, that's so creepy. Like, where is the rest of his body then? To this day, his mummy has never been found. It's believed that maybe grave robbers got to his body, but we don't know for sure. Hey, maybe he just wasn't a fan of his left foot and wanted to be buried separately from it. I'm just kidding, but that is creepy as heck. He's not the only mummy who's missing though. His chancellor that was buried with him has never been found either. Weird. In our 8th spot today, we have the toxins. Exploring ancient Egyptian tombs and pyramids can be very deadly. In fact, a number of deaths that may have been caused by the ancient Egyptian curse might just be from the scientists coming in contact with deadly pathogens. Like, they're entering a place that has been opened in thousands of years. These places are home to dead bodies and dead animals and rotting food. In fact, researchers discovered that some ancient mummies carried mold. This type of mold can cause congestion or bleeding in the lungs. Also, bacteria such as Pseudomonas and Staphylococcus may grow on the tomb walls. On top of that, scientists have also detected ammonia gas, formaldehyde, and hydrogen sulfide all inside sealed sarcophagi. Discovering this must have been a huge wake-up call to them. It just goes to show how dangerous their job really is. They're potentially being exposed to life-threatening toxins. Moving on, at number 7, we have the Valley of Mummies. In the mid-1990s, a team of archaeologists came across something pretty creepy. They unearthed 105 mummies all in the same vicinity. At least, originally, they thought it was just 105. In the end, they found hundreds more, but they believe that they haven't even found them all. They think there could be as many as 10,000 mummies out there. That is so creepy. Some of the mummies were even covered with creepy masks, others chest plates. Others, though, were just in plaster or linen coverings. In the end, they realized that the area was an ancient Egyptian graveyard. So that's great. They just dug up dead people and wonder why they get haunted or cursed. Like, come on, just let them rest in peace. Coming in at number 6, we have the canopic jars. As part of their burial process, Egyptians would place the internal organs of the dead into 4 jars before mummification. One jar had the person's lungs, the other the stomach, another had the intestines, and one for the liver. Why did they do this? Well, to preserve the organs, because it was thought that the person would need those organs in the afterlife. Now, imagine being the first archaeologist to find these jars. They're beautiful. The jar lids were carved with the heads of the 4 protectors. You had the baboon head, the jackal head, the falcon head, and the human head. So they were probably like, score! Rare ancient Egyptian containers, whoa! Until opening it up and finding dead parts inside. Sorry, but that must have reeked and then freaked them out. We're now at our 5th and halfway mark with the little coffins. Back in 1922, when Howard Carter and his team found King Tut's tomb, they also found something quite strange and unsettling. They found an undecorated wooden box in one of the burial chambers. Upon opening the box, they found 2 small infant-sized coffins in it. One coffin had "The Osiris" inscribed in it. The other had nothing. After opening the coffins, they found that they contained 2 mummified premature babies. Here's the creepy part. They were buried in King Tut's tomb, meaning they must have had some relation to him, meaning they were probably his kids. But one of the babies had some abnormalities and birth defects, and that these babies were ones he had with his sister. Isn't that just great? Coming in at number 4, we have the curses. Ancient Egyptian tombs and pyramids are filled with ancient curses. On a number of occasions, archaeologists have been exploring these ruins when they come across ancient curses inscribed on the walls. Let's take a look at a man named Zahi Hawass. He was on the team that excavated a tomb at the Pyramid of Giza. That's when he encountered a curse. When translated, the curse read, and I quote, "All people who enter this tomb who will make evil against this tomb and destroy it, may the crocodile be against them in water, and snakes against them on land. May the hippopotamus be against them in water, the scorpion on land." End quote. Now, I'm not entirely sure what that means, but you know it's creepy and that they're pretty much doomed. Anyways, he claims that he was not superstitious, but the curse did freak him out. In the end, he later moved 2 child mummies and reported he was haunted by them in his dreams. This did not stop until the mummy of the children's father was reunited with them. Not gonna lie, that's really freaking creepy. In our 3rd spot today, we have the human sacrifice. During one excavation, archaeologists found several servants slaughtered and buried next to a pharaoh's tomb. Turns out that the Egyptians would sacrifice servants and other individuals when a pharaoh or person of power died. They did this because they thought that if they were buried alongside them, that they could continue serving them in the afterlife. Imagine how creepy it must have been unearthing all those dead bodies of people that were sacrificed. Extremely creepy. Moving on to number 2, we have King Tut's heart. So I think I know the reason why King Tut is mad and has released this curse on Earth. It's because his heart is freaking missing, okay? So like I said, all the vital organs were placed inside canopic jars. Now, the heart was very important to the Egyptians. The Egyptians thought that the heart was required for someone to get into afterlife. So it was always left in place, never removed. If it was accidentally removed, they made sure to always put it back in and sew it shut. But when King Tut's body was found, they discovered his heart was missing. Like, those things were preserved so they don't decay. So does that mean that somebody cut him open to steal his heart or what? Who really knows? But it is very creepy if you really think about it. And in our number 1 spot today, we have the mummified animals. So we all know that the Egyptians loved their cats. But did you know that the Egyptians used to brutally kill cats and other animals just to mummify them? Yeah. So apparently they had special farms that would breed cats, dogs, birds, reptiles, etc. These were then destined for mummification. So when someone died, they could bury them alongside these mummified animals. In fact, x-rays of some of these animals showed how gruesome their deaths were. How come we never learned about this in ancient history class? Like, that's dark.
Starting us off at number 10 is the claw. So back in 1986, an expedition was undertaken on Mountain Owen in New Zealand since there was a network of unexplored caves under the mountain. Yes, because exploring caves with little to no light always ends well for everyone involved. Thankfully, nothing horror movie-esque happened other than them finding a few bones here and there and then a gigantic claw. And honest to God, when I saw the picture of it, I was like, what the hell was living in that cave? And I hope to God it didn't have kids. Forget kids, what if its hungry cousins were nearby? Like, you're still done for either way. And I'm not even talking like a small bear claw, I'm talking 4 massive claws that were most likely attached to a dinosaur ready to steal your kids and your wife. Hide your kids, hide your wife. Now, it definitely wasn't Jurassic Park 2.0, but the team managed to find 3,000-year-old remains of an upland moa, which was basically a flightless bird. Flightless or not, it could still probably tear you apart on foot. Coming in at number 9 is the caveman, and before you skip this one because you think it's just one of those basic old cavemen that we keep finding, it's not. Just putting that disclaimer out there. One day, a speleologist, someone who studies caves by the way, was looking through the Lammalunga cave network in Italy when he found the Altamura man. And I kid you not, if you have trypophobia, I really recommend not looking at this one or its pictures because it's really just very cringy. I get goosebumps just thinking about it and looking at it, and I don't want to. The skeleton of this man was covered with white bumps, as was the cave. It's like the man and the cave just became one. And I honestly don't know where one started and the other ended. What really happened was that a Neanderthal from way back when must have fallen into the cave and died of starvation. Eons later, a layer of calcium carbonate built over his remains, thus preserving them but also making you want to vomit. Basically, the cave ate him and is still eating him. After scraping off a bit of his shoulder, researchers concluded that Altamura man is the oldest Neanderthal ever found. Fact of the day. At number 8 we have cannibalism. We need backstory for this one because how did they just magically dig up cannibalism? They didn't. Relax. Back in 1845, the Franklin expedition was a British voyage of Arctic exploration which went promisingly underway but ended up in disaster. On the way, the HMS Erebus and HMS Terror got stuck in the ice and were trapped a lot longer than expected due to very cold summers. By 1848, the 129 men aboard the ships decided to leave and do a 1,000-mile trek to the closest trading port, which was Hudson Bay. On the way there, researchers were sure the men suffered from many things like scurvy, hypothermia, lead poisoning, etc. that could have been what caused them to leave their ships, which were essentially their only food source. Like, they packed enough food to last them 5 to 7 years, yet they still left. Something doesn't add up. None of the men survived, and even the Inuit of the area stayed away from that region because food was so scarce. After recovering around 35 bones from the area, anthropologists noticed the bones had been broken and many had cut marks indicating someone had cut the flesh from the bones, so cannibalism definitely had occurred amongst the crew. But the bones also exposed something a lot more gruesome. They also showed signs of pot polishing, which means the ends of the bones were heated in a boiling cooking pot. And that only ever happens in the last stage of cannibalism, when someone extracts the marrow from a bone to get any nutrition they possibly can. This all goes hand in hand with what Inuit eyewitnesses said they saw, which were piles and piles of fractured human bones. Filling our number 7 slot is the sewer. So I didn't know excavation could be done in sewers, but apparently it can, so a group was doing just that under a Byzantine bathhouse in Israel. After a while of finding nothing, they started coming across hundreds of thousands of little bones. And after finding nearly 100 bodies, they realized they were waist deep into a sewer that was specifically for getting rid of newborn babies. Despite doing a lot of research, no one knows the real reason all the bones are down there. Initially, researchers thought it was just for female infants, since at the time the parents of these kids would have seen girls as less valuable. Thank God we grew out of that, guys, but either way, some of the bones also belonged to male babies, so it wasn't that either. And that's how far their research went. I wish I could tell you more. So in conclusion, we found 100 baby corpses in a sewer, and we're just apparently gonna just sweep it under the rug and move on. Now at number 6 are the headless Vikings. So along a road in Dorset, archaeologists were doing some digging when they came across the remains of 54 Viking mercenaries. But the scary part was that all the corpses were headless. The group went on to record the positioning of the bones when they realized everything was conveniently in its own pile. The heads were all together, the legs and arms were arranged, as were the torsos. Initial theories were that the Vikings tried to occupy a village nearby, failed, and then the villagers came and murdered them and took some of the skulls as souvenirs. Honestly, I highly doubt this, because aren't Vikings meant to be pretty jacked and very good at fighting? I feel like they would have beat the villagers. Another more viable theory was that the Vikings may have been sacrificed in a ritual, which explains the bone arrangements but has no link with the culture around the area, so you win some, you lose some. Coming in at number 5 is the Screaming Mummy. So back in 1886, Gaston Maspero, the head of the Egyptian Antiquities Service, was bringing mummies out of their sarcophagi. Side note, I love when the plural of something ends in I, it's just very amusing to me. Anyway, he came across one sarcophagus that was quite plain. The ones of queens and kings usually say very clearly who's buried inside, but this one was just a bit of a mystery. Inside, it was wrapped in sheepskin, which was seen as low class and unclean in ancient Egypt. Either way, when Gaston finally uncovered it, the corpse's hands and feet were bound together, and the person also died screaming, or so it seemed. It looked like the person had been tortured mid-death, or was buried alive, or maybe even poisoned. As sadistic as that sounds, after a lot more research into mummification, they realized unless the jaw is strapped shut when the body is mummified, then the jaw just naturally falls open anyway. So in that regard, I guess all mummies are screaming mummies, but this person, known as Unknown Man E, was the first. At number 4 is the pit. So back in 2012, archaeologists were surveying an area in Bergheim, France, when they found around 5 acres of pits called silos absolutely filled to the brim with human bones. They uncovered 60 silos, 14 of which were filled with bones, because that's totally normal in this day and age. One of the silos just had dismembered human bones, which shows a hell of a lot of amputation took place to fill it up. Other bodies were found which had suffered trauma blows and stabbings as well. Why are we uncovering so many pits or tombs filled with suspicious dead bodies? Like, how did people not have to report this stuff or write it up back then? Like, I'm very confused. Either way, bodies of adults, children, and even infants were found and were estimated to be around 5,000 years old. Filling our number 3 slot is chemical warfare. So back in 1933, an archaeologist by the name of Robert Dumesnil was doing a dig near Dura Europa, which is where the Persians seized the Romans. This whole video is a history lesson, I love it. During the dig, he went through several tunnels and he happened upon the bodies of 19 Roman soldiers. All the bodies were positioned as if they died running away from someone or something, and at the end of the tunnel was a single Persian soldier found literally clutching his chest in his armor. After an investigation and then a re-investigation of the original dig, another archaeologist found that all 20 men died due to one of the earliest attempts at chemical warfare. The Roman tunnel was above the Persian one, so they planned to break into them from above, but obviously the Persians could hear everything they were doing. So the Persians came up with a plan to light a fire in the tunnel and throw bitumen and sulfur on the flames, which caused all of them to die. As they breathed the choking gas inside, it turned into sulfuric acid in their lungs, leaving them all dying a slow and painful death. Now at number 2 are the Polish vampires. In 2016, a group of archaeologists were doing a dig in a cemetery located in West Poland. They uncovered graves dating back to the 13th and 14th century, but it was the way the bodies were buried that caught their attention. All the corpses were either mutilated, decapitated, punctured in the spine or sacrum, pinned down from the neck, or bound. All these methods were believed to physically stop the dead from rising again, so researchers believe the locals assumed these people were vampires. One woman who died was believed to have kyphosis, a condition that gave her a hunch which could have led people to believe she was a vampire. She was buried face down and her knees were broken in various places. Another man with the same condition was buried the same way, and the third body was buried with their head between 2 big stones, and I just feel bad for this person. Most of these bodies were probably not vampires at all, but victims of cholera, and people believe the first person to die from an outbreak would return as a vampire. That's sound logic. And finally, at number 1 is the murder tomb. Back in 2009, a group of archaeologists were excavating the bottom of a prehistoric dry lake bed located in Motala, Sweden. They weren't expecting to find much since they were just doing it because the area was being paved for a new railway line, but they struck gold. I don't know if I can even call this striking gold, but sure. They ended up uncovering a stone tomb structure of some sort at the bottom of the lake, and after getting it open, discovered the skulls of 10 people. All of them were 8,000 years old, and it ranged from elderly skeletons to babies as well, so no one was spared in whatever was going on. But it gets even worse. After digging deeper, they found fragments of other skulls lodged into an 11th skull. I don't know how you would even shove skull fragments inside someone else's brain while they're still alive. This is some Hannibal Ting right here. Anyway, they also found a lot of bodies that had been torched alive and that had stakes driven through them. And that wasn't even from guessing. The group literally found 2 skulls with stakes melded into their skulls. No one can think of why the murder tomb was there. Perhaps some warriors mounted the skulls of their victims onto stakes, or maybe some innocent people were killing off a vampire infestation. I have no idea.
Starting off this countdown, we have the missing couple. Back on August 15th, 1942, husband and wife Marcelin and Francine Dumoulin of Switzerland went out to milk their cows and never returned home. Their 7 children wondered what happened to them for years, and they never gave up hope. 75 years later, their last remaining child got the answer. Their bodies were found frozen in the Alps after a glacier covering them melted. Researchers believe that the couple had fallen into a crevice which they stayed trapped in until they froze to death. The only photos released to the public were the items that they found next to the bodies, like their hiking boots and destroyed clothing. Actual photos of their frozen corpse has not been released due to respect of the family, but also for our own sake. It would be pretty gruesome to see a body frozen to death. In our 9th spot, we have the bones in a tree. In 2015, Clooney, Ireland was hit with a massive winter storm. As a result, a number of trees were uprooted, including including a 250-year-old tree. What people didn't know is that this tree was hiding a very, very dark secret. Entangled in the roots of this tree was a mass of bones. After investigating, they found that the bones belonged to a young fellow who died between the year 1030 and 1200. To make it worse, his ribs and hands had knife marks, suggesting that he was attacked, murdered, and then buried there. Here is a picture of the tree, but photos of the lad's bones in the tree roots has not been shared with the public. In our 8th spot today, we have the bog bodies. This discovery actually happened quite recently in terms of archaeology. It just happened over 15 years ago. A group of archaeologists were exploring an area in Scotland when they came across a number of bodies. But these were unlike any skeletal remains that they have ever seen before. No, these bodies were the combination of 6 different people fused together. Let me explain. The bodies were of one female and one male, who died about 3,000 years ago. But because of the state that they were in, it's believed that their bodies were thrown into a bog where they mummified for about 300 to 600 years, and then after that they were actually taken out and buried. So that right there is commitment. After analyzing the bodies, they realized that the woman's jaw was way too large for her skull, and the man's limbs were all off. Well, turns out the female was combined with body parts from several others that died around the same time as her, whereas the male had body parts from people who died hundreds of years before him. And the bones weren't just pushed in together, they were actually attached properly. This has still baffled researchers. They literally found a bunch of Frankenstein bodies or something, and we don't know how they were created. Was this part of some weird ritual? Was this the works of a serial killer? Or did the bog somehow fuse them together? Honestly, we might never know. The medieval home for nuns. Back in 2015, British archaeologists made a pretty disturbing discovery that left them speechless. Over in Oxford, England, while excavating Littlemore Priory, which is a medieval home for nuns, they found 92 skeletons. These skeletons date back to between 600 and 900 years old. Lead archaeologist Paul Murray said, and I quote, "We knew the church was there and we knew we could find something, but the number of burials was a real surprise." Some of the remains they found belonged to a person with leprosy, who most likely was shunned because of their disease. They also found a skull from someone who died from blunt force trauma to their head, and a nun that was buried face down. Face down burials were meant for people who were either witches or accused of witchcraft or a sinner. In this case, they think that that nun was promiscuous and was getting on with priests, which is a sin, and so she was killed and buried with her face down. Photos from the site have not been released due to how unsettling they are. In our 6th spot, we have the Pit of Amputated Arms. In 2015, a team working in France got a terrifying glimpse into the past after stumbling upon this next discovery. They found 7 severed arms that had been brutally chopped off, probably when the victims were still alive, and then the arms were thrown into the bottom of a pit. The pit and arms date back to 6,000 years ago, and researchers believe that the arms belonged to farmers. To make matters worse, the arms were at the bottom of the pit, and on top of it were dozens of bodies just piled on. The bodies on top still had their arms attached, so they weren't the victims of the severed arms. But they had their skulls crushed in. It's still not clear what happened to these people. We don't know who killed them or why their arms were removed in the first place. All we know is that it's evidence of a horrible massacre. We are now at our 5th and halfway mark with humans eating other humans. In 2019, archaeologists working at a site in southwest Germany came across 1,000 human remains. The remains were unearthed near a village from a 7,000-year-old human burial site. Now, archaeologists come across bones all the time. To them, it's no big deal, but these bones were. These people weren't just killed, they had their skulls scraped clean. The ribs had been peeled from the vertebrae, and some of the bones were snapped in half and their marrow had been sucked out. So this was evidence that humans attacked them, killed, and then ate them. Moving on at number 4, we have the witch bottle. Back in 2019, a number of artifacts known as the witch bottle were found in homes in England. One of them was found in a chimney of a pub during demolition. Now, witches' bottles are really quite strange. The one in the chimney contained fish hooks, human teeth, and urine. Other bottles have been composed of fingernails, human hair, bent pins, nails, shards of glass, and thorns. Typically, they are found in churchyards, riverbanks, or old buildings. They were made as a way to ward witches off. Apparently, the urine attracted the witches to the bottle, and then they would be trapped by the pins or the other sharp objects. I mean, it's kind of cool, but also it's definitely a strange find. Moving on to number 3, we have the whale vertebra. Archaeologists excavating a Scottish Iron Age site in 2016 came across something they never thought in a million years they would find. They found a hollowed out whale vertebra that was then filled with a human jawbone and the remains of 2 newborn lambs. Definitely an interesting collection of things. These items date back to about the mid-2nd century AD, and to this day, it still baffles scientists. Did the people back then hunt down this whale, or was it washed up on shore? The bigger question is why? Why did they take it, hollow it out, and then put things inside? And whose skull is that? Not only that, but the whale vertebra was held in place by a pair of red deer antlers and a large grinding stone. So this mystery just keeps getting weirder and weirder. In our second spot, we have the shackled skeletons. In 2016, a number of archaeologists were excavating a site in Athens, Greece, when they came across something straight out of a horror film. They found a group of 80 skeletons chained up with iron shackles around their wrists. To make matters worse, the skeletons had a terrified expression plastered on their faces. Their necks were flexed and their jaws hung open wide. Studies showed that all the skeletons were males who suffered horrific deaths. These skeletons belonged to prisoners from around 650 BC. Their death was very gruesome. They were all chained up, and then an executioner went down the line killing these men one by one, while the others watched, just waiting their turn. So no wonder why they look like they're screaming for their lives, because they probably were, and that is absolutely horrifying. And in our number 1 spot today, we have the hollowed out tree trunk. In 2019 in Switzerland, archaeologists stumbled upon an Iron Age Celtic woman placed inside of a hollowed out tree trunk. This acted as her coffin. She was placed there in a dress made out of sheep's wool, a sheepskin coat, and shawl. She was also buried alongside amber and glass necklaces, bronze bracelets, and other valuables, meaning she must have been a very important figure of her time. Archaeologists found the grave while renovating a school complex, and they were completely stunned, as anyone would be. Imagine being like, oh, what a nice tree trunk. Wait, there's a body in there. That's how I imagine their reaction was. Photos have not been released to the public, only animated, reenactment photos have.
First up, in our 10th spot today, we have screaming mummies. Okay, when you think of a classic mummy, what do you see? I'm going to assume you just replied, I see the mummy's face, and it looks like it's screaming as its mouth is, wide open. For a very long time, it was believed that mummies found with their mouth open were possibly people that were tortured to death, especially those found with their hands bounded together. But in most recent years, scientists have learned how silly that theory might be, because most mummies are actually found with that permanent screaming expression. During the mummification process, if the jaw isn't strapped shut, then the jaw naturally falls open when it begins to decay. But then again, we're also sure that some of the mummies were most likely buried alive, but it is possible that it could be too hard at this point to fully know. In our number 9 spot today is the mass grave of the headless Vikings. It was a sunny day. Just another casual digging expedition for these archaeologists, digging up the side of an old roadway in Dorset, UK. But suddenly, they dug up something extraordinary. It was a grave site for 54 Vikings, and they were all headless. The leg and arm bones and heads and torsos were all together, neatly in separate piles. The archaeologists didn't know what to make of this, so their theory was that these people were captured by the locals and they were murdered and dismembered by the villagers, who took some of their heads for souvenirs. Well, that's terrifying. Later on, they revamped that theory and they believed that perhaps that this was some kind of ritualistic sacrifice performed at this time. Yeah, perhaps scientists didn't want us to know this because, well,
that is terrifying. Coming up in today's 8th spot, we have something that I personally think is highly unsettling, and I would like to inquire as to why wasn't this on the news stations everywhere around the world when it was discovered? Because this one is kind of hard to believe that it is real. Oh, what is it? Oh, it's just a cat that was carved into the hills of Peru. Yep, a cat. Come on, a cat? That's so creepy. I mean, I'm a dog person myself, so perhaps I'm a little biased, but I mean, cultures have been known to worship and honor the cat throughout centuries, including the Egyptians and, well, North Americans nowadays. They have, a lot of crazy cat ladies, but who knows, maybe there's a higher reason that cats were continuously worshipped and perhaps we should honor them. This cat geoglyph was found in the Nazca Desert, and it is said to be the oldest one in its region, dating to 200 BC to 100 BC. The cat is apparently 120 feet. Wow, how isn't this more known? I'm mind blown. All the crazy cat Karens are saying, excuse me, I knew this. Coming up in our 7th spot today, we have the Tomb of Sunken Skulls. Found in the bottom of a prehistoric dry lake bed in Motala, Sweden, archaeologists stumbled upon a mysterious stone structure. After some digging, they were able to eventually unearth animal bones, stone tools, and 8,000-year-old skulls of 10 people aging from young to old. Sometimes it's hard for me to fathom that it is possible for archaeologists to know that something is really that old. Like, how is this possible? That we are able to know this, and yet we haven't made a time machine yet. But also, if you really sit and think about how far we've come in the last 100 years, it really makes you think, holy, I wish I could travel in time to see how people actually lived then. Because even with our discoveries to paint a picture, it's still quite hard to imagine. They also found fragments of one skull deliberately put into the skull of another. What purpose was this for? The archaeologists concluded that actually 11 people were butchered in a stone hut, with no other discovery as to why. But one last final horrific detail: some of the skulls had stakes embedded into them, and it was concluded that they were perhaps mounted for some funeral purpose or as a sort of trophy after the defeat of its opponents. In our 6th spot today, we have a discovery that honestly, I wish I didn't know about. For all the mothers out there that are feeling a little sensitive, definitely, close your ears to this one. While on an expedition deep in the underground sewer in Ashkelon, Israel, expecting to only find dirt and, well, poop, archaeologists discovered thousands of tiny bones. After further inspection, they discovered that the bones were of newborn babies, maybe around 100 of newborn babies. Just horrible. It wasn't completely uncommon though for ancient times to dispose of newborns, particularly girls who were considered not as valuable to the family as boys. But it is interesting though that there were actually quite a few boys that were found. It was and still is so curious that those bones were disposed of in a sewer. If I could guess, I think this sounds like the case of some religious sacrifice, but who knows? In our 5th spot today, we have the Mammoth Graveyard. An expedition in Russia led to a discovery of what looks like a graveyard of mammoth bones from 25,000 years ago. The site has been under excavation since 2014, and it is said that it measures 40 feet across. Whoa. At this point, archaeologists still don't know how it was built, and also why. What was the purpose of this? I suspect aliens. Aliens came down to Earth and had a sacrificial mammoth ceremony and then gathered all of the bones in one area and left them for us humans to eventually clean up. That sounds possible. In our 4th spot today, we have severed hands. While on an Egyptian expedition, a group of archaeologists whom were digging near the ancient city of Avaris discovered a few chopped off hands. The hands were found in what was once a throne room, and therefore there was an immediate understanding that this was some kind of gesture for the king. The team ended up discovering 14 hands, and the even more interesting part, it was all right hands. The hands are about 3,600 years old. Eventually, it was discovered that they were buried when King Kian ruled over the city. Only through reviewing ancient writing were they able to put the pieces together and see that during this time, the soldiers would present a severed right hand of his enemy to the king in exchange for gold. It was said to be a symbolic gesture, showing that they are depriving their enemy of power as they will no longer have their hand. Fascinating. It's crazy to believe that we humans once were in a headspace where we were chopping off hands so as to take other humans' power away from them. Fascinating. In our third spot today, we have the good old Neanderthals. Archaeologists have discovered that some 40,000 years ago, Belgians, also known as Neanderthals, were practicing cannibalism. They used to make a meal out of their friends and create tools out of their bones. At least they weren't wasteful. This discovery was made in a cave where Neanderthal bones were discovered along with marks of butchery. There were also bones of horses and other animals in the cave, but they seemed to be stripped apart just like the human bones were, leading the archaeologists to conclude that these Neanderthals seemed to make no distinction between man and animal, which poses the question, at what point did we start making this distinction? And are there still people who don't? Google the conspiracies around this at your own risk. In our second spot today, we have the claw. In 1986, while on an expedition on Mount Owen in New Zealand, a giant claw was found. Deep within a cave in the mountain, the archaeologists discovered this massive beast-like claw. It was eventually discovered that it was the 3,000-year-old remains of an upland moa, a flightless bird that went extinct, which you would think to be impossible as well. It kind of reminds me of how all the Kardashian-like girls wear their nails these days. I mean, how do they function with those nails? I can barely type and I barely have nails. Melissa. In our number one spot today, we have the chemical warfare. On an expedition in 1933, archaeologist Robert de Mesnil du Buisson discovered 19 Roman soldiers in a tunnel. Apparently, they all look like they died trying to flee from something. I can't imagine what during those times. Traces of sulfur and bitumen were actually found along the walls until it was eventually discovered that all signs point to this being one of the first attempts at chemical warfare. Whoa. And honestly, hopefully one of the last. That's all I'm saying.